So what are the specific components we have to have in place in order to put an assessment framework in place that can be feasibly applied on an operational and strategic basis? And I think that there's these four elements. The first is the management indicator. So we talked about that. Speed, going back to the car example, speed is a management indicator. The speed limit is the management objective. We need to have those management indicators that reflect each one of our values, and I'll talk about the specific characteristics that are associated with each of these boxes. We also have to have some sort of assessment of our current condition. So if we know where our management objective is, we know where the line in the sand is, we need to know what our current condition is, and to make sure that so that we know how much headroom we have. How much development are we willing to allow before we hit that management objective? Where are we in that big piece? This is part of understanding sort of the situational awareness of the ecosystem and human well-being in the region, to use military terms. The other thing we need is some sort of near-term trends, and I use this instead of the foreseeable future because I think that we do need to have some idea of what is going to happen in the future, because knowing how close we are to a line in the sand is not enough. We have to know the rate at which we're approaching that line. And the way we understand the rate at which we're approaching that line is understanding near-term trends. And these are the broad socioeconomic indicators that tell us what is likely to happen in the future. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So if we take these elements and put them into a figure, this is really the figure that's at the heart of doing an assessment of cumulative effects. We have impacts that tend to increase over time as more and more projects occur. But we have this management objective that we want to maintain conditions below that management objective. That's our line in the sand. Do not cross this line is what really our message is to proponents. And what we can do to stay below that line is come up with operational and strategic recommendations so that we have conditions that are attached to permits or the right planning processes in place to bend that line down, to keep it below that line in the sand. There are some situations where we might find, if we go out and do our inventory of current condition, that we're actually above that management objective. And in that case, we're more into a restoration mode. We want to really bend that line down to get it below the management objective. And so that's really the key. Understand the risks, where we are relative to the management objective, and come up with those operational and strategic recommendations that keep us below the line. And of course, we have one of these objectives, one of these graphs for every one of our management indicators, which is linked to all of our values. And this is basically the assessment approach in one figure. So now let's run through these different components and talk about some of the desired characteristics of these things. So on the management indicator side, we want to make sure that when we're talking about the management indicators, data are available or feasible to collect. Everybody can figure out the speed of their car. It's an easy thing to measure. Everybody understands what it means, and it's easy data to collect. Some other indicators, for instance, condition of the road surface, might be more expensive to collect, and some things might be infeasible to collect. So we want to make sure that the data are available or are feasible. We want to make sure that our different management indicators are mutually exclusive. So the reason we want to do that is that we want to make sure that we're getting the most information we can out of indicators. So if we have indicators that are kind of non-overlapping, we're maximizing the amount of information we can get from a minimum number of indicators. Ideally, we want to map this because the map is conceived as a spatial process. So the more we can map this stuff, the better off we are, because it aligns with what we're trying to achieve in map. We want to make sure that our indicators are under management control or influence. So there's all kinds of indicators, climate change for instance, where they might be important to understand the state of ecosystems or the state of the well-being of communities, etc. But there's not much that we can do from the perspective of the envelope of available management in the North Pacific. So from that perspective, we want to make sure that we pick our management indicators carefully so that they are under management control. And aligned with that, of course, they need to be responsive to management change. So if we change our management, we can reasonably expect to see changes in those indicators. If not, we're not going to know if we're doing any better. We want to make sure they're easy to understand. We need to have indicators that cut across all different sectors. So everybody needs to understand. We can't turn everybody into a sociologist. We can't turn everybody into a biologist. We have to have indicators that are easy to understand. And we have to have clear effect pathways. So we have to know that even if our management indicator itself, the speed of your car isn't directly related to, say, mortality risk on highways, but you can certainly see the effect pathway that leads to it. Higher rate of speed, it leads to more accidents, blah, blah, blah. So that we want to make sure we see that effect pathway. And ideally, we want to have this linked to the extent possible to existing regulation and policy. And I know that that's an issue because the regulation and policy isn't necessarily there for the marine environment. And obviously, there's going to be a role also for engaging communities around this, and that's what this last bullet is talking about when we're talking about aligning this with the emerging management model. So when the MaPP process is complete or moved to the implementation phase, and we have the regional and the sub-regional plans, those will be implemented, and there will be some management and model associated with that. We want to make sure that the development of these indicators are aligned with that management model so that we're not wasting effort and making sure that we're producing products that will be respected and will be durable as the plans are implemented. Objectives. So I'm talking about objectives here. I'm talking about this line in the sand. So this is very much the way government talks about objectives, where it's things that we do not want to exceed, or things that or some sort of minimum. And ideally, we would like to see these baked into regulation and policy. And there's a bit of a parallel on the terrestrial side, because the EBM process on the central and north coast led into a legal land use order. And in that order, there are actual numbers and targets for things that one expects to achieve. And so those are now in regulation that at least the forest industry is expected to follow. There's obviously, as I said, some role for community engagement here in terms of establishing what those management objectives what those management objectives should be. But again, we need to keep those aligned with whatever the emerging management model is, so that we know that whatever are the outcomes of that community engagement process, that those outcomes are respected in terms of meeting those objectives. And as I already talked about, it's important to frame those objectives in terms of desired outcomes, not necessarily against an ecological baseline. And this is a controversial point, and I think there's still quite a bit of debate here. Should we be managing to an ecological baseline, or should we be is that how we should be establishing our objectives, or should we be really talking about just thinking about what we want in the future and managing to that? And obviously, as I said, a lot of work can be informed by our understanding of baseline processes and how we got to where we are now. But I would argue that it's really important to stay focused on those future outcomes rather than giving putting a lot of effort into defining those ecological baselines. We certainly want those objectives to be science informed, but we also want the objectives at this stage to have some socioeconomic considerations baked in. So this is the place where we want to have the trade-offs made. So, and this is typically how governments establish objectives. They're presented with some baseline scientific information that says, if you manage this particular value to this level, this will be the consequences socioeconomically, and this will be benefits ecologically, etc. And you can look at those different levels, and then government makes a political decision and says, okay, this is where we have decided the appropriate trade-off here is, and this is what we're going to in policy make sure that we're managing to. So that's part of the objective setting process. We want the management objectives to be quantitative, because if you can't measure it, you can't manage to it. So they need to be quantitative. And again, they have to be respected by all sectors. And I'm not downplaying that at all. That's a thorny issue to make sure that everyone is respecting the same lines in the sand. Inventory of current condition is very simply a way of characterizing what the state of the management indicators are relative to the objectives. And they can be presented as maps or as graphs, typically graphs with lines on them, as I've shown you, or maps, red, yellow, green, whatever it might be, just to give us an idea of the state of the environment, broadly defined socioeconomic, ecological environment, and gives us that kind of situational awareness, to use a military term. And then this concept of near-term trends. So what are the drivers? What are the short-term drivers that are going to move our management indicators in the short term? So this could be any kind of social, economic, or ecological indicator. So for instance, what do we expect to happen to the price of natural gas, the global commodity type prices in the next 3 to 5 years, and how do we think that's going to drive demand for development? What are the big ecological ones? ENSO, for instance. There's a number of these things that can tell us what's going to happen in the near term. And as I said, it's important to understand those near-term trends, because how close you are to the line is not the only issue here. It's how quickly you're approaching. And we could actually be very close to the line with some of these indicators, but the near-term circumstances suggest that the risk is not imminent. So it's important to understand that near-term stuff. So I'm pulling back this picture again of the assessment, showing this graph. And the idea here is that there'd be one of these graphs basically across all of the indicators that are linked to values, and the current condition is somewhere along that line, and we want to make sure that the trajectory is staying below that objective. And we want to be in a situation where we're not trading off among indicators. This is not a trade-off model. Again, this is a controversial point, and I don't think everybody would completely agree with this, but I'm advocating that there be no trade-offs at this point. The trade-offs come when we're establishing those objectives. Because the problem is, if you have trade-offs at the decision stage, in other words, you hand a statutory decision maker information on a bunch of indicators and say, okay, you decide whether or not the permit should be issued or not. And it's left with that individual statutory decision maker to make the trade-offs among those values. You've lost your transparency and you've lost your consistency, because whether or not the permit is issued depends largely on whose desk that application fell on and their personal views on how those various trade-offs should be weighted. If you establish your trade-offs in a more transparent way at this management objective stage, then it brings a lot more transparency to the decision maker. And once again, the goal here is to identify the risks to the values and to identify the potential solutions to stay below that line. The recommendations can be either, as I've said, at this operational or strategic level. So examples on the operational side is you could have strategies to mitigate impacts. You could have permit conditions that require restoration, or also fitting in with the emerging provincial policy, some sort of offsetting model where mitigation and restoration cannot fully address impacts. You could have some sort of financial offsetting, for instance. You can simply stop issuing permits for some amount of time until conditions return to where they should be below the objective. Or perhaps you've identified risks, but there's quite a bit of uncertainty associated with those risks, and additional inventory might help you determine some sort of path forward. So that's another kind of operational recommendation. On the strategic side, There might be recommendations to change zoning or protected areas. We've talked about that. Those are both map outputs. There could be recommendations for additional research, or you could also have some recommendations that would lead to changes in the indicators, for instance, the management indicators or the social well-being indicators or the ecological indicators, some sort of change in how the monitoring, how monitoring occurs.